Okay, thank you, Rafael, for coming to the podcast. And we tried a few times already, and I
Yep.
think this is a good one.
Well,
So
and just to let thank you, and just to let your viewers know, I sound like this because the reason why we weren't able to do it a few weeks ago is because I had laryngitis, and I guess I still kind of do. So I probably sound really hoarse, but that's just how I sound right now.
no, don't worry. I mean, as I was telling you before, I was also with a strong cold, and it was
Yeah.
like grateful that you couldn't because I couldn't also. So it was like a perfect
Right. So
timing.
that worked out great then.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, yeah, we had just before we started the recording, we were just talking about the exo switch constraint, because that they had also been, I guess your viewers were your listeners, however you post this, will probably
Yes.
have heard that podcast first. Because I actually really considered the idea of trying to use the exo switch constraint as a part of what I didn't really have a conception of the ephemeral system as I is now at the time, but trying to do things like this, there's definitely some similarities there. And at one point I wasn't was thinking about using their constraint as the basis of it. um, and even though I didn't end up going in that direction, there is one thing that it really inspired me about, which is the idea that the rig behaves differently depending on what you have selected.
Yeah, that's
um,
really cool. Yeah.
because that's in many ways I think a really central idea that is important, right? And in their case, it behaves differently because the direction of the switch, right, is dependent or can be dependent on selection. And you might say that the ephemeral system, though it's conceptually actually ended up being something very different, has that in common, that uh what rig gets built, as it were, um, depends on your selection, and also depends on your settings. And one thing that the earlier systems that I've been playing around with to do this sort of thing, the one problem that they had was I kept being like, well, you could have different kinds of rigging, you could switch between them, but
Hmm.
they had to be either defined each time by the animator, or they had to be explicitly built. Like I'd actually have multiple rigs in the scene, kind of like how Richard Lico does it, and none of those things felt free interaction wise in the way that I wanted. And then I ended up eventually coming around to the ephemeral rigging way of looking at things. Um, but perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe maybe some of your listeners may not even know what the heck I'm talking about. So I don't know if you want to or I should give some sort of introduction to the concepts that I'm
Yeah.
referring
Well,
to. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know. Well, I mean, I know you have ready this presentation. Maybe
That's
you
true.
want to jump straight there, or do you want to make a little demo explanation here with the Maya interface? I don't know what you prefer.
Uh, you know,
I don't dare to explain what is your system because I think you're here for, and
sure.
it's much better if you explain it because it's a very I only can say that I'm very fan of your approach and not only the system because ephemeral what one thing I can say maybe on what I how I see your system is not like the system, the rig system itself is your workflow because it's a new approach. It's a or it's a really fresh view of how to animate in general, like as a workflow as a whole, like with tools
Right.
and the process.
Yeah, the process is really different. I mean, maybe I should switch to the presentation. I have that up too, and because that goes through all of the ideas rather quickly. But just to show this, it's like, all right, I can interact with things in this way, or I can interact with things in this way in sort of a forward K way, um, or I can treat the entire character as like basically forward K, from any node, and it doesn't care. All it's doing, and like if I switch back to a different form of manipulation, now I'm doing this. Essentially, what I'm doing there is I'm constantly switching contexts, but not switching the behavior of the rig in any persistent way. And what's going on under the hood is that the rigs being in my own rigging graph, because this wouldn't really be viable to do with the Maya node graph, the rigs being rebuilt from scratch every single time I go to interact with it, so that it can behave however I want it to behave right now, just based on whatever key I have these hotkeys set up to switch different contexts, and not have to think about how does how does the rig affect interpolation with other states, and what state am I switching it into, and what effect is that going to have on other animation.
Mm.
And that's the sort of thing that I end up ranting about quite a bit, because although I did not realize this at first, and this has been a very long journey in many ways, it's ended up with me coming around to the idea that keyframes themselves were a mistake. Right, preframes are not a good method for manipulating animation data, and that's a somewhat controversial position, right? That's not a very normal
Yeah.
thing for an animator to
Yeah.
say after all this time. But
Yeah, sorry. So when you say keyframes, you meant like I know you work like the frame or the keyframe that it's more in a
mhm,
classic 2D animation. It's just
that's right,
one frame that it's a completely full pose on that frame. And when you
indeed.
meant keyframes here, it's like when you go with the graph editor and you have for different parts of the character, like let's say the arm or something like that, you have like maybe not on the same frame all the positions set for the full character. You have some positions or some values set in different frames, and you work with the
Yep.
graph editor curves to easy ins, easy outs, and all these kind of things. That's
Right.
correct. What my
Well,
guess?
well, right. In that, that's the conventional workflow, is that you have things on different frames, and I'm explicitly like this system actually demands that that not be the case, right? The way that I'm thinking about keyframes is that the concept of a key drawing or key pose has actually become something entirely different from what keyframes mean in a CG context. In a CG context, a keyframe is a control point on a spline, and that spline describes one single scalar value. It doesn't describe anything other than that. And so obviously the term came from traditional animation, and it came from the idea of like a key drawing that's at the extreme of movement, but that's actually not what it means in CG at all. You can
Yes.
use it that way if you want to, right? You can choose to make poses at extremes of motion, as we as animators do all the time in CG. But that's not actually what keyframe means. And as a result, what's ended up happening is that it's walled off most of the ways that you'd want to interact with a character, because they're incompatible with the concepts of interpolation that are inherent to this idea of you have all these axes and they have splines associated with them, and that has to reduce to something that's going to happen in a particular parent space. Like, so one thing that is like I'm really is really important to me about this is that there's no real concept of space switching as we know it, right? So if for instance you could say here's like a two-way connection, behaves in some ways a little bit similar to the way the exo switch constraint would,
Hmm.
but nothing about the channels in this controller actually changing its own world space. So if I just pop that in here for a second, so you can see what's going on here. I mean, maybe looking at the values probably doesn't tell
Hmm.
you much, but I don't really have to. I'm not actually. Nothing is in a different space as far as Maya is concerned, which means that I can totally change it anytime I want. Like if I want to just turn off that kind of interaction, I can go move these two things independently, and then like change their relationship to each other in any way I want, and then I just turn it back on, and now it's back on.
Yeah.
Um, and I can hand off things between things without having to hand them off on a particular frame,
Mhm.
which is actually
Yeah.
kind of an important thing. So there's not really anything going on in this particular shot that maybe would require that, but like there's a one that I have up, which I actually don't have available right now. I probably should have had been able to import it, but I don't have it here with me. That where she's swinging on a chandelier,
Mm.
and the idea there is there isn't some particular frame where I'm like, all right, on this region of time, like the hand's attached to the chandelier, and in this region of time the hand isn't, or the body is. Like all of that wrangling constraints that goes on. Instead, I'm saying for this particular breakdown, or or breakdown in between, however you want to put it, or for this particular interaction where I'm moving the chandelier around and I want her hand to stick to it. Under those circumstances, they're attached. And under
Mhm.
some other circumstances, they're not attached. And what has ended up, what I've ended up coming to the conclusion that I feel is really important about this is that there's this cognitive load associated with understanding how the system's going to behave under different conditions. And all you really want to be able to do for purposes of making the alteration to the motion or making the alteration to the pose that you want to make right now is I want to understand how it works right now. Like
Mhm.
these two things are attached right now.
Mhm.
Um, Understanding the implications of that for the rest of the shot
Mhm.
is an undue burden on animators, right?
Mm.
It's something that gums up the works because you have to constantly consider the consequences of what you're doing, and it makes this thing. And here again, I'm like repeating a bunch of stuff that's in my presentation or it's on my blog, but I don't know if everyone who's listening to you has necessarily
Mhm.
seen all these things. It's really easy as an animator to paint yourself into a corner, right? Where
Yeah.
you're like, okay, well, I put some keys in some particular places that seemed like the right idea, and I just made some decisions about rig state, like FKIK switching or handoff of props with constraints and space switching, or whatever stuff that I have. And I made a bunch of decisions about those things, and then you know now everything has to change because something changed about the shot, which could be because the director decided the shot had to work differently, which of course happens all the time, or it could be because you looking at the shot, like you shouldn't trust yourself to necessarily always know the right thing to do from the get-go. Right? Nobody does. The greatest animator in the world doesn't. You're going to make changes. It has to be okay to make changes. It has to be okay to throw things away. And it becomes so easy to paint yourself into a corner. Here, so if I switch back to my presentation for a second, one of the things, and I had to like kind of rush through this on the show floor because I only had, or rather, not the show floor, the presentation room, because I only had I had 20 minutes to give the whole SIGGRAPH
Yeah.
presentation, so I had to like rush through it at top speed. But I ended up coming up with this like big list of things that are really bad,
Mhm.
that come out of the complexity of the rig keyframe system. And spline death is that thing where like you have your nice shot that you've blocked and it looks good and it reads and the characters work, and then you spline it and it's horrible and it dies and it kills your shot dead, and then you have to like resurrect it, through
Yes.
this complicated process of like either you're going to add more keys or you're going to go into the graph editor and sort of tweak things and mess
Yeah.
around with them. And that's just this arduous process that maybe eventually resurrects your shot to actually being good, which
Yeah.
I think really tells us something actually,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because
I
the thing
agree.
that, yeah, the thing that was supposed to be good about CG, like way back in the day, the thing that was supposed to be good was the idea of like, oh, you don't have to make your own in-betweens, right? The thing that was supposed to be good was the computer can handle a lot of this stuff for you. And what I think we've seen in the decades since, CG animation became a thing is that people were just forced to continually try to work around that problem actually, right? Like, um, I think that when people were first looking at something like Luxo Jr., right, which really was one of the, I mean, there were many early animation that used keyframe systems, right? But that's like maybe one of the most famous ones. Looking at that and being like, okay, this is really the right thing to do. Like, this is how animation is going to work in the future. And, almost immediately you see that becoming complicated once things like IK get introduced, once animators want more complex ways of interacting with characters. And the moment you have something more complex than a Luxo lamp, right? You go from what's really quite nice animation, like Luxo Jr. holds up today. Like that's a pretty amazing feat, to like Toy Story 1, which doesn't hold up today at all.
Mhm.
And part of the reason for that, I think, is that they're not Luxo lamps, right? They're complex characters. They have limbs, they have fingers, they have, and so a whole lot of stuff needs to happen. There need to be a whole lot of channels, or avars as Pixar calls them, and stuff that are going to add up to the appearance and the performance of the character. And managing all of that stuff in a direct way is actually, I think, not really possible for human beings. But then, and so as animation, like when people wanted to make better animation, and as animation quality like improved over the ensuing decades for everyone, I think it improved in part because people were moving away from that. People started out with like the hips out view of things, and then you moved into like, okay, well, there's going to be poses and breakdowns more like traditional animation. um and like I personally had that experience, right? Like halfway through my career, maybe it was less than halfway, I don't know. Like it's that thing where when you're young, time seems to move more slowly, right? So
Yes.
like when I started out in the 90s, I definitely wasn't thinking about things like a traditional animator. And actually, one of the things that's sort of funny about my view of CG is that I've never done drawn character animation, right? But
Hmm.
I went from being like, oh yeah, CG is this great thing where we can manipulate characters in different ways, and I don't even want to think about things the way a drawn animator does,
Hmm.
to going like 100% in the opposite direction. To actually drawn animators mostly had this pretty much figured out, and we came and screwed it up, right?
Yeah.
Like the more I tried to figure out like why isn't my animation better, like what can I do to make my animation better,
Mm.
the more I had to move away from the way that
Yes.
CG, the keyframe system,
Yeah.
sort of expects you to behave, and try to like minimize that. So when I'm sort of, this was a bit of a tangent, but when I'm talking about spline death, it's like, well, okay,
Yeah.
when you take the way that the keyframes were intended to be used, and you say like, okay, well, first my shot is good, and then when I turn on the splines, it dies. I think that
Yes.
tells you something about
Y-
actually the
Yeah.
utility of that method of
I,
doing
I, I,
things.
yeah, I totally agree in there, and I have a good example. Like I think it was 2003, 4. I had my own studio, and a good
Hmm.
friend of mine, 2D animator, was coming to work with us. It's Santi Jimenez, if I have to shout out him, and I teach him how to do like 3D animation. And
Hmm.
I quote there, like I didn't teach how to do 3D animation. I just show how the software worked that back in the day was Softimage, and
Hmm.
he did some animations for some shows and some tests. And what he did, it's just like very like, okay, don't give me the curves, just give me the dub shape, and he put a keyframe every 2 frames. It animated in twos,
Hmm.
and it was amazing. It was everybody
Yep.
was like, and he didn't. uh, It just his mind. It was so clear what he wants that he didn't bother even to edit the curve. He just put keyframes where he needed, like you do, like full frame
Yep. Yep.
pose. And of course, he didn't have the tools, or the rig was a regular rig, and so it's not like. But the idea that he understood the animation, he understood the full pose, he understood everything, and he didn't need to use the curve editor or anything. It just went to straight to what he needed. And I don't know where. I still must have this animation somewhere in a hard drive, and they're still holding super nice and really, really, really good stuff. Very, very
Yeah.
cool. So yeah, I
Well,
agree
then
with that.
I think for me, one of the real eureka moments in a lot of forms was actually when I saw the early Chicken Little stuff that Disney was doing. Actually, I think they, maybe, I don't remember if this was before the film had come out yet or not, but it's some SIGGRAPH in like maybe
Hmm.
2005. I'm not really sure. They sort of showed what they were doing, and at the time,
Yes.
animators, myself included, really believed a lot of things that aren't really believed right now. Like there were people who were just hardcore, like never use IK in the upper body, like never use it for arms. And like this sounds insane, right? This sounds insane today, right? But they're like, no, you need the FK system to be making your arcs. And like that was actually a really, like there were like debates, like there were practically fist fights over this, right? Some people
Okay.
would be
Oh
like, yeah,
my
we
God.
like using IK for this stuff, and people were like, I mean, I'm
Wow.
not joking, obviously there weren't really fist fights, but there were people like, no, that will make your animation bad, right? um
Uh,
like it's amazing to think, like, and this goes along with this idea about like, as animation quality and technique and CG has improved, we've just moved further and further and further away from that rig centric, keyframe centric conception of things, just in order to be able to have good animation, right? And so the two things that there was that when I saw what they were doing with broken rigging, right, which is sort of like a part. like I think of broken rigging concepts, which if people haven't heard the term, is like sometimes people call it free rigging. It's like, well, you have a bunch of transforms and your controls don't have a lot of effect on each other, as sort of presaging ephemeral rigging. It solves some problems but creates others, and so I'm trying to solve the problems without creating others, right? But and seeing how alive their animation felt, right? And I was looking at the stuff that I was doing at the time and the stuff that other people were doing and being like, wow, actually, that's actually better, right? The quality is better, and of course, partly that's because they had good animators, right? Like, it's obviously a big part of it. But it's not like other people didn't have good animators. It's not like other studios didn't have talented people. It's that it was very hard for them to express the stuff that they wanted to express, or at least that was part of it, right? I mean, this is a complicated subject, but like just like it says on the second line here, like rig state management, right? It's like the moment you get away from something like a Luxo lamp, where like you've basically got the equivalent of like 3 controls, maybe 4, and it's an FK hierarchy, and an FK hierarchy is pretty much, I mean, an appropriate way to model that, right? But the moment you get away from that, the moment you get away from something that's so easily modeled by a hierarchy, things just fall apart completely. You want FIK, you want the ability to have other kinds of ways of manipulating the character, right? I mean, you'd have special case rigs in some cases for shots. You'd have all of this stuff that would go into. I mean, the very concept of space switching basically comes from the fact that the very idea of having a single space that a control can be in is inherently problematic. But because interpolation, which has to happen in the conception that we have of it, like, has to happen in a particular space, right? What do those splines mean if they don't refer to the x-axis of a control in its parent space, right? What else could it mean, right? It has to be in a space, or you couldn't interpolate it. Then the animator has to manually manage that stuff, or the system can try to manage it for you and fail horribly. Which, excuse me, is of course what sometimes happened. I remember having some very bad experiences working with Biped and Max, for instance, where, and some other systems too, where people would try to have the system try to manage some of the handoff for you, and it never had very good results, right? Because it's an inherently, it's something that where inherently the choices you make about that, the choices you make about how to manage your rig state, will affect what your motion looks like, and so it ends up having to be under animator control. And then the runaway rig complexity. So here's one thing that I didn't expect doing the ephemeral system, but I think has ended up being something really interesting about the control rig specifically, because in the ephemeral system, the deformation rig is just, I mean, I'm using rig tools, which maybe we should also talk about today, but like, that's not the subject we're talking about right now, which is our spline-based deformation. So that's a little unusual. But it's still happening through the Maya node graph, right? That's being done with nodes in the Maya node graph, driving a mesh, just like you would expect, with the ephemeral system sitting on top, not being inside the Maya node graph. And what actually turned out to be true, because I wrote the ephemeral system in Python, was obviously not, an exceptionally performant language, and I wrote it, it's entirely single-threaded, which A, it has to be because Python, and B, even if it didn't have to be, I wasn't going to deal with multi-threading. I'm not that, I'm not enough of a software engineer to want to deal with locking threads and stuff, and that would have been necessary for the approach that I was taking at the time. And I'm actually working on a new version of the system, which could eventually be multi-threaded, because it's architected very differently, with Tagore Smith, who is my partner, one of my partners, along with Brian Kendall and Notional Pipe, which is doing going to release rig tools and is continuing to work on the ephemeral system. But certainly the prototype that I did now, like, that was never going to happen. And so here's what, and also it just created constant garbage objects, like, as part of how it does its evaluation. Largely because in the Maya API, that's something that, unless you really want to work hard to avoid it, you end up doing a bunch. And so I kind of expected it to be slow. And though there are some performance issues, they're not related to actually running the ephemeral graph. The ephemeral graph runs in like a fraction of a millisecond in the very worst case scenario. And as far as I can tell, this is entirely because of lack of complexity, right?
Yeah.
Matrix math isn't actually that, like, it's not that complicated for a computer to do. If you're not doing that much of it, then it's just going to inherently be fast. And uh, the the thing about rig complexity is when you have a rig that's got to manage an enormous amount of stuff, because you have a
Yes.
lot of alternate ways of controlling the character,
Hmm.
and you have a lot of complexity between the control rig and the deformation rig, because you've got to like break down whatever's coming out of the control rig and turn it into like whatever twist joints or
Yes.
whatever complex stuff that you end up having to have going on in there. When you add all that stuff up together, you end up with these rigs with like 10,000 nodes, right?
Right.
And one solution to that is something like MGear, where a lot of that actually goes into a solver. And there's a variety of other ways you could try to approach that. But like that's actually well, I mean, and to be fair, parallel eval has made that kind of thing a lot faster than it used to be, right? But
Yes, I was commenting, yeah, with the Exetools people, like that I was lucky on that because it was not on purpose, but it worked much better with parallel, was like
yep,
almost ready before I knew was a thing, the parallel thing.
yeah,
And
I mean,
but
no,
it's a
sorry, go ahead.
halfway. No, but MGear is a halfway. I mean, we have the solvers, but it's not like we do a lot of nodeling and a lot of use of nodes. And I never counted how many nodes we have in one like biped, but must be by the order of that magnitude for sure, I
Yeah.
think. So yeah,
Yeah, and it is, ultimately in rigging, I feel like this is a problem, and it's a problem that comes from the fact that the rig has to include, and in many cases evaluate, even if it's trying to be lazy about it, a whole lot of stuff that isn't actually germane to whatever the animator's trying to do right now, right? Whereas if I just build the ephemeral rig only ever actually does exactly what you're doing right now, it has no interaction with like there is no other rigging, right? The rig
yeah,
just gets created and destroyed
y-
constantly. And if you have, for instance, an FK rig, if you're manipulating an FK mode, that's all there is.
yeah, and
There's
and
the
and yeah, and it's created on the time of manipulation. So it's not like
yes,
you select your configuration in the moment and then you manipulate. It's you start manipulating an arm and then and you set your like hotkeys and
yep,
that will be I'm not sure how you set up this, but basically it's on the fly. So it's
right,
something that you decide at the moment of manipulation. So not even when you are setting everything to make the pose on this frame specific, but
yep.
depending
So
of what
for instance,
you're doing. Yeah.
yeah, so for instance, here's an elbow. This is the default behavior. I just hit the Z key,
Mm-hmm.
which means that now it has FK behavior, right? And what
Mm-hmm.
actually happened there, and I kind of try to show this in the presentation with
Mm-hmm.
this video here, which
Can you
why is
make
it not?
the full screen the presentation so
Yeah,
maybe the
let
people
me
who
try
is watching
doing
the
that
record is
actually.
not cannot see. But by the way, your presentation it's on your website.
Yes,
That's
it is.
correct. I saw it the other day that you posted. So if the people want to see more clearly everything and review all this presentation, it's available online. We can
Yep.
put later your website address and everything so people
Sure.
has easy access to everything.
So oddly enough, I think that PowerPoint is maybe I don't actually have like a copy of PowerPoint on this machine because it's not. I don't even think it's going to play this video. Why don't I
Uh,
just grab the video itself because I have it, right?
yeah,
I can
much
just go
better.
get it from my SIGGRAPH folder where I made this presentation. Um, in videos, probably presentation edits. No, this is the that's not where I put it. 1 second. Uh, yeah, this is a classic case of I did not really organize this stuff particularly well as I was throwing like I have a folder here called additional bits. Like,
Huh?
I was in a panic before SIGGRAPH trying to like throw this stuff all
Uh,
together. So it ended up being a little bit
y- yeah, I can guess
unfortunate,
must be
but
stressing.
I think this is actually, yeah, here we go. Here we go. Um I think this is intro 1080. This is probably it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So basically, what I did here was I put there's no GUI to the ephemeral node graph, so I can't like show you what it would look like in Maya because there isn't one, right? There's only behavior. However, what I've done here is I've just in Illustrator made these representations of what the graph looks like on different interactions. And so what you're getting here, if I play this back, is like while I'm interacting, this is the graph, and you notice it just turns into a completely different graph from one interaction to the next. It just is whatever graph it needs to be, based sort of in a rule-based way. So based on the interaction between the settings that I currently have, you see those up here for interaction, and the whatever I have selected, it builds whatever graph is appropriate and just runs that graph as I manipulate. Which, is not the easiest thing in the world to set up in Maya, right? And there's still questions about what the best way to do it is going to be going forward. I ended up having a discussion with some people at Autodesk, and they were very helpful in, there's some ideas about how to solve some of the issues here. Like for right now it doesn't work with parallel eval, for instance, because the parallel eval looks at the nodes in the Maya scene and tries to figure out how to schedule them. And my stuff does not exist in the Maya scene. It's basically just making like sets. I don't know. It's calling stuff through OpenMaya 2 to just move the nodes around directly. So parallel eval knows nothing about that. But there are ways to get around that issue. And there will be a version that will work with
I'm sorry. Parallel evaluation, it doesn't solve all the things in the world. I mean, it do what it does really well. But in some situations, in very specific situations, it's better to keep in DG. Like
indeed.
Yeah, in the system, and also for my experience, like if you're doing like shot sculpting, because you add in shapes in every frame to fix it's better to keep in DG, because if not, it's gonna try to evaluate your rig for each frame to populate all the evaluation order. So it's gonna be way slower because you rebuild your graph. Like when it says like if you have the hub, it say like ready or need to rebuild. I don't know if you saw that, but anyway, just once trying to make the point there that not every single situation is good with parallel.
It's true, although I think that this situation is one that ultimately will be, once those issues get solved, because the deformation rigging could be parallel and faster than it is. Because that's all running through the Maya node graph. It's a matter of, I think it's going to end up being a matter of at what time in the evaluation cycle, like the data gets inserted, and the way that I'm doing it right now, which triggers on node dirty callbacks is like how I find out that the user's interacting with the scene, is probably not. Like it's probably not the right way to do it. There's probably a better way, but it's going to take some research to figure out what the best way to do that is going to be. And ultimately, there's a lot of different ways you could potentially do that. You could write custom transform nodes, like all kinds of stuff, right? That I probably don't have to do and don't want to do, but there's going to be some way probably to make that work. We'll find out how complicated it ends up being. But anyway, the idea here is just what the relationships between these things are. Have no canonical setup. Like there is a default, but it isn't really privileged over any other way of interacting with the rig. The way that like the DAG is sort of privileged over the DG, right? You have the DAG. There is this hierarchy. That is the parent space of your transform. That defines what the parent space is, and the DG can sort of counter that using the way constraints do, or just by supplying a matrix. But that's all sort of running counter to this existing idea of there is there is this canonical hierarchy and everything has to be relative to that. And that concept doesn't exist in ephemeral rigging. There is no canonical hierarchy, right? The hierarchy is whatever your system says it should be right now.
Yeah. I see here, for instance, just in the frame that you have in the video now, it's you're using scaling to pose your character, but it's not behaving like if you have like an FK hierarchy or more classical approach to the rig. If you do what you are doing now, it's gonna have like effects in the head and everything, and it's gonna squash. And here the scaling just means just make the torso longer. No, it's what.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was actually accidental, but turns out to be a really cool thing. What happened there, how that happened, was that when I wrote the part of the system that makes things act like they're parented together,
Hmm.
because since there's no canonical space, there is this idea of a um, there's a constraint in a
Hmm.
sense. Like it's not really like a Maya constraint, but it's I use the term constraint because it's familiar, which is basically just when this node is being driven in an FK like way, how does it react to the incoming matrix of its parent?
Hmm.
Um, and I removed all scale and shear from it because I realized that that could potentially be a problem, right? Because if you have an FK hierarchy and you have scale and shear, but the hierarchy doesn't change, right? You're not unparenting stuff, then if things get a little scaled or sheared, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Whereas in this
Hmm.
scenario, where things could relate to each other in any way, then it's a
Yeah.
huge problem because you don't want like errant shear values and scale values to be sort of like
Mm.
collecting in things. That would be a bad idea. So I just had the function that calculates, um, this transforms new matrix in response to the parent, remove like basically just remove scale and shear from the matrix that it returns. It just makes one with default scale and shear. But it so happens that what that actually does is it means that you have these things that are relative to their parent, but scale and shear does not propagate. It propagates to their translation and their rotation because those things are being affected. They're not being removed from the final matrix, but
Hmm.
scale and shear are, and so that actually turns out to be like kind of a useful manipulation concept.
Yeah.
Um, in theory, I think in a larger context, in an ideal world, right? If you wrote animation software purely to work like this, you could have a variety, like any like the space of potential manipulators. Because
Hmm.
you can think of each of these modes of interaction as like almost like it's its own manipulator or something. It isn't in Maya, just because that's not how the system behaves in Maya, but conceptually it kind of is. And so you can sort of imagine these as just like, well, they're just different tools for interacting with the character, and you could have a tool that like lengthens parts of the character, and that could have a specific set
Hmm.
of interaction handles that are especially useful for that purpose. It's not really scale anymore at that
Hmm.
point, right? It
Yeah.
just so happens that the scale manipulator in Maya is the manipulator
Hmm.
that most likely does that thing,
Yeah.
but it's not really the same thing as scaling an object in the traditional sense.
Hmm.
um so
Yeah.
I guess we ended up like going off on a bit, tangenting quite a bit there. But
Sorry.
we're gonna have to get around to that stuff
Yeah.
eventually anyway,
Yeah.
because I did kind of want to go back to the
Yeah.
the the bad consequences of the ray keyframe system and
Yeah.
maybe like finish
Yeah.
with that. Um, excuse me. Yeah, it is. This cold is unfortunate. I will say that. But anyway, yeah, gimbal lock, right? Like, why do we still use Euler angles? Like, Euler angles are terrible. They're terrible in every respect. There's no good reason to ever use them, except, of course, to have, uh, values that make sense that you can interpolate.
Yes. So if you
That's the
don't
only
use
thing.
curves,
Right.
like
You don't use
graph
curves. Why
editor,
would you? Why would you ever? You don't need them for
yeah,
manipulators. You
it's
don't need them for.
parse.
And you
Yeah.
don't need them to like generate breakdowns and do that kind of interpolation. In fact, they're terrible for that purpose. What are Euler angles good for? They're really bad. There's nothing they're good for. We shouldn't be using them except for the fact that that's how the interpolation system works. Um, I ended up coming around to the idea that IK pop is not really a problem with IK actually, and I used to think that it was. I ended up developing for the Senate Machine 2, like an anti-IK pop system, and you sometimes see these. I don't know if I'm the first person to have come up with it. I'm probably not, but
Mm.
like certainly I wasn't aware of any prior ones where,
Mm.
as you approach the extent of the IK, things just start to lengthen
Yeah.
slightly. So like, yeah, so you've probably seen these before, and that's all very well, but it's actually not particularly relevant to the problem. The problem's interpolation, right? The
Yes.
problem isn't what does the limb look like right now. The problem is what does the limb look like relative to the frames around it.
Yeah.
So that's a consequence of the way that the
Mm.
system interpolates. Um, Emergent behavior between levels of control. This is like one of my primary
We-
like this
Yeah.
is so bad.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, because I don't understand that concept. Can you elaborate?
Sure,
Can you
sure.
explain that?
So, like here's a classic example, like uh and it will appear if you have animation layers or even if you have an FK hierarchy in a lot of cases. So here's like a simple example. Let's say you have a character's eyebrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're posing that eyebrow in various ways. And as is pretty common, right, you have one control that moves the whole eyebrow, and then you have some little controls that like let you tweak the eyebrow, right? And
Yes.
so you do like big movements with one and then you tweak with the other. And if you do that exactly right, then it's probably fine. But what if you don't do it exactly right? What if you end up posing the eyebrow using the little ones and they end up pretty far away from the big one, but it still looks fine, like it looks good, right? And then what you find out when you're interpolating these things with other keys that aren't like
Mm-hmm.
that is that now you have this crossing of effects. So you've got your high level control, and it's got its own interpolated movement, and maybe that movement is smooth. And you've got your low level controls, and you have their interpolated movement,
Mm-hmm.
and that might be smooth. But maybe the result of both of those things on top of each other is not smooth. Maybe it bobbles
Mm-hmm.
around or has some like weird looking
Mm-hmm.
little movement in it that's not good, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is this is just this perennial like issue that just creeps into shots, and it's like a huge part of polish is like getting rid of situations like that or making sure not to create them in the first place, which is also a big part of cognitive load. If you're like when you're posing your character, you're starting to worry about questions like which control should I be using, because how is this going to end up interpolating with
Yes.
these other poses?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's horrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not what you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about your character and how they feel, and if the shape that they make on screen is an interesting one and stuff. And so on a larger level, this tends to happen a lot. You can see that in cases, even something as simple as an FK arm, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have more subtle motion, right? You get this thing where like the hand ends up like having this like weird little bobble to it or something, or it hits a wall, like you have a little problem. You can't just go fix them because they're
Mm-hmm.
actually caused. I mean, you can, you eventually fix them,
Yes.
but that's actually caused by the emergent behavior of the shoulder
Mm-hmm.
and the
Yeah.
torso and like and the pelvis and literally everything, right? Um, so I think that's like a really serious problem with rigs, and one that's very very hard to get rid of in the context
Yes.
of persistent rigging, like where you just have this rig that exists all the time. Um, and it just bedevils animators, right? It's this constant problem that we don't have like a comprehensive good solution for, that shouldn't even really be a problem. Like what kind of a job as an animator is it to worry about stuff like that instead of all the things about character performance that actually matter, right?
Mm.
um, and then offsetting keys create spaghetti splines, is something that I'm starting to see some solutions for, actually. Like you see in Animbot, they kind of have a system that lets you kind of offset the curve but keeps the keys in the same frame, which is certainly better than not having that. But essentially, the problem is shifting things around in time is actually a great idea in CG, right? The
Mm-hmm.
fact that you can do that is a genuine advantage of CG over drawn animation. Like, we should try to take advantage of the things that are actually better about our approach, except that the consequences of doing that, because of that emergent behavior between levels of control, like, oh, you shift something, and what consequence does it really have, right? The consequences of doing that are so dire that in a lot of cases, people, and this is often true of me, just won't. Right? Like, I don't offset keys. I mean, I will occasionally when I'm animating in a traditional, more conventional CG context. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying I would never do it, but I leave it for the very, very end of polish, because I know what it's going to do is to make my stuff uneditable. Right? So maybe there's something where that's just the most expedient way to solve a particular problem or make something look a little bit better, but I'm leaving it for the last possible moment, because I know it's going to, if I ever have to make significant changes to the shot, it's going to destroy my ability to do so efficiently, right? And then so the consequence of all of these things is you paint yourself into a corner, like I was saying, right? You end up with just situations where some changes maybe are easy, and then some changes are just prohibitively painfully difficult to make. And I feel like it's a really essential thing for us as animators to be able to make changes in a
Mm-hmm.
reasonable fashion, right? Like, I remember having a discussion with an animator with a very different set of points of view. And this was quite some time ago, so I don't know what he thinks about it now, right? Where he was sort of saying like, well, look, but I have this, like, I have a shot of this character running, and what happens if the director is like I want him to like bounce up a little bit more on each step, and I can make this change really easily in the graph. It would be harder for you with your, at the time I didn't have ephemeral rigging yet, like
Hmm.
what the methods I was trying to use at the time, and I was like, well, that's fine. um but how often really does a director say, there's like, that's the feedback you get, is I want my character to jump slightly higher, and how often is it, I want my character to turn around and run backwards for a step, or I think this character needs to stumble, or I think this character needs to like, like whatever, like he uh something about the character's performance,
Hmm.
and reducing that question to how high are the hips is, like, in my view, kind of a useless question to even ask. Like, who cares how high the hips are? The question is, you know, does this character's overall pose and movement, what is it expressing?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, because it's not just moving offset one curve. I mean, if you set one curve of your hip, you probably need
right.
to rebalance everything. So it's not like, yeah, of course, you move the hips and the move are higher, but now you need to readjust everything anyway because, I mean, the animation doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
The balance is gonna be off, the pose is gonna be off, the silhouette is gonna be broken. Everything that you work as a nice like animation probably is gonna be discompensated, especially on the hips that it's the usually the center of gravity of all your character
Yep.
and affects everything.
Well, the way that he was approaching this was he wasn't concerning himself. I mean, this is what used to be a very, very common, and frankly still is in some contexts, right, way of looking at animation. It was that hips out way of looking at things. So if one thing he had pure FK from the hips up, right? Which sort of goes along with that way of looking at things. So that the question of, it was like, yeah, well, if you move the hips, it is going to move the entire upper body. So it's not a question of like, oh, what's that going to do to the arms, right? Although, of course, it is a question of what that's going to do to the arms, because the arcs of the arms will now be different. But in this way of thinking about things, you're like purely thinking in this hips out way. And like, that used to be pretty common, right? Thankfully it isn't anymore. And I think I credit to some degree the fact that CG animation is so much better than it used to be, to the fact that people don't really think about things that way anymore. I mean, not wholly. Obviously, it's not that. Like, I don't want to overstate my case, right? That's just one contributing factor to that. But if you do look at CG animation in almost any CG film, like today, where people have paid attention to animation as a priority, versus the early 2000s, like the difference is huge,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you could have stuff in a movie
Hmm.
released in theaters in the 2000s, that the early 2000s especially, that like no animation supervisor would like ever okay in the modern day at any studio, right?
Hmm.
Um, uh, and I mean, for me, actually, like, I actually went through a period where I was starting to think, like, maybe CG is just bad. Maybe CG was a mistake, right? Like, maybe like
Yeah.
the art of maybe we've done violence to the art of animation with these techniques. And what ended up making me feel differently about that was actually Tangled, right?
Oh.
Where I saw Tangled, which, Glenn Keane had this like really heavy influence on, was like, oh, okay, you can actually do this. This can actually be good. And it wasn't just Tangled. I mean, things were really getting better across the board at that
Mm.
time. Pixar, like Incredibles was a huge deal, I think, in terms of Pixar's quality of animation improving and stuff. And
Yeah.
again, it's like, partly, I mean, I'm this is a supposition, right? Like, I wasn't involved in any of these
Hmm.
productions. I, you know,
Yeah.
and I don't even know
And
anyone who wasn't just
I
like maybe at the periphery of them. But it
yeah.
feels like to me like the influx of drawn animators really had a big effect on all of these studios.
Yeah, I think also like Sony Image works with the work they did in Cloudy with Meatballs
Yep,
and later with
absolutely.
Hotel Transylvania, that they just pushed the borders a bit more cartoony, everything, and it was not like this Pixar-ish or Disney much that is, I think it's different, the style,
Hmm.
and it start open doors, I think, for different styles, so it doesn't need to be like the Pixar like canon
Yep.
on the way that I think many other studios was trying to as a goal. And now with I guess like Spider-Verse was a big
Yeah.
shift on this, and yeah, and I think also like it's funny on here in Japan like this the anime
Hmm.
style, like you can say that it's a kind of a style also that we use I mean, uh, there's a lot of motion capture depending of the project. But the like, let's say this cell shaded style, like CG anime, there's a lot of like this kind of that it's not important, like more the interpolation or things like that. And I think it's very especially you can see on Spider-Verse that it was a lot of common ground on a style and on type of animation. Of course, the production times, budget, and crew is different, so you cannot
Sure.
compare. But I feel like it's more close to Japanese animation in some ways than what is to other more like
Mhm.
traditional CG animation, let's say.
Well, I would say that probably one of the ways that manifests, or like one of the things that makes it feel that way, is that there's a real attention to the graphicality of things, which anime has always had a big focus
Yes,
on. You know, like,
yes, pose.
and which I mean, American studios have had a focus on that too, but not in quite the same way or to the same degree. Especially in earlier CG, traditionally rendered sort of CG films, where
Hmm.
sometimes the lighting was really flat, you know, and that's really changing actually in a lot of ways, and has been changing for a long time. I mean, there's really beautiful images in a lot of CG films, but that's, I think, been increasing over time, right? Like at the beginning, it was like very, it was very stock and not graphical, and I think that Hotel Transylvania is actually a great example, in part, of this thing of having to think about things in a
Hmm.
way that's different from the way that CG sort of wants you to think about them. I mean, my understanding, and again, like, I had nothing to do with any of these productions, right? So, I'm going off of sort of stuff I've heard, but my understanding is that, just like with Tangled, like an enormous amount of the look of that film basically comes from Gendy. Oh, I'm gonna mispronounce his name. Tarkovsky.
Yeah,
Pretend I pronounced it correctly, okay?
yeah.
Um,
Don't ask me. I'm always like
Yeah,
terrible
I
with
should, I should
names and
probably look that up, right?
Tarkov.
I apologize if
Uh,
he's in the unlikely
um,
event that he's listening to this, which is very
yeah,
unlikely, but I he's drawing over this stuff. He's like, this is the graphical feel that it needs to
yeah,
have.
yes.
And CG has traditionally been very, very bad at presenting things graphically, because you couldn't just put things where you wanted them to be.
Correct.
Like part of the basis of this way. I mean, that's one of the things that broken rigging was one of the first steps towards changing. Like, part of the basis of this way of doing things is the fact that, like, here, let me switch back to there we go. That's the mode I thought I was in. Sometimes that happens, of course, but I'm actually want to improve. One of the things I really want to improve here is I want to have things based on holding down keys
Hmm.
instead of using keys to switch modes, because I feel like that'll make it even
Uh,
more like, oh, it's, I know exactly what I'm doing when I'm doing it, instead of having to look at uh,
yeah.
look at this to know what
Hmm.
modes I have available. But the point of this really is that I'm like, oh, I want to describe. So actually, here's another thing. Let me show something. Is like, how does this knee is trying to react in sort of a pseudo IK like way, which doesn't really seem right for the pose that I'm making here, right? So I'm just going to turn that off, right? I'm going to go mid controls free, and now I'm going to be even more specific about exactly the arc that I have here, in multiple contexts. Um,
Yeah, one of the things I would like to talk before we run out of time, it's yeah, one of the like the ways that talking about the workflow, how to use to animate with your system,
mhm.
it's one key is like the thing that we talk about, it's interpolation less, like is the
Yep.
concept that you talk about that it's like I think we already talked on that, no graph editor, and it's just the full keyframe
Yep.
for each frame. So I mean, like the character, it has a full pose as a concept, like no.
Yep.
But also like your animation workflow, how do you approach the animation? How do you? I saw some breakdowns that you did on your website with the little monkey and this character
Mhm.
some time ago. But I would like you to explain a little better how it works, how it feels, so how it's to work with this
Yeah.
approach.
So, maybe the easiest thing there. Let me go get the video of the chandelier scene, because I can sort of like scrub through that maybe a little bit, because that might. I mean, let me show something live first. For one thing, in the current system, and I should really note that the current prototype isn't ultimately like it doesn't represent everything I want this to be, you know, because
Mhm.
right now there are certain ways it can still box you in, that I think could be very much removed. But let me just show real quick like how you'd go about creating in-betweens, because you go and create them one by one, actually. It's
Mhm.
just that this process is actually very fast. So for one of the things is you absolutely have to have onion skinning. And actually here's something that you know, I would generally say about animation, right? It's absolutely insane that CG tools that we haven't had for years onion skinning as a really primary thing. Like it's insane. It's crazy. Like
Mhm.
animating, I now feel like animating without onion skinning is like animating like blind.
Mhm.
Because you can't see what other poses look like, and it is really really essential to see them. And so you know, whether or not I'm using the ephemeral system, I always use onion skinning. Um, and the tool that I'm using for this, which is a bit of a hack because of course Maya was not really designed to do onion skinning, but it's a very good hack, was developed by a guy named Christoph Lendenfeld, and it's open source and freely available, and I really highly recommend that everyone do that. I was going to have to write my own, which I didn't really have time for. Um, and now I'm really glad that I didn't have to because he already did it.
Mhm.
But anyway, I'm going to switch to the onion skin renderer. And basically, so you have to know what your poses look like, right? So here's onion skinning. They get drawn as I'm going through it. Here's the one that I messed around with. That's why it's so weird. Like in our example, so I'm not going to use that one. But you know, so like okay, so here's a here's a you know, here's a frame where it's in between two poses, right? Now, so one of the things that's maybe worth noting about this is that in the ephemeral system, even though I'm taking advantage of the Maya timeline to display these as key ticks and stuff, because that's, I mean, I didn't want to write my own GUI for this and stuff. But really, conceptually speaking, even though they're made out of keyframes at the like lower level, um, these poses and keyframes are not really quite the same thing. And one of the ways that they're not quite the same thing is that they have a duration. Composes do rather. Keyframes do not have a duration. Keyframes are like, I'm on a particular frame, I interpolate with the things nearby.
Mhm.
Um, and excuse me. That means you know, and if I have stepped interpolation, like maybe I hold it to the next one, but I still have a particular value on a particular frame, not a particular value over a particular block of time. So here we're like, here's this pose for 2 frames, and then there's another pose at frame 284.
Mhm.
But maybe I want to make a pose, you know, I want to make a breakdown on 283.
Mhm.
So if I go and make a new pose there, and I'm going to make a breakdown in like the simplest way that's available, which is I'm just going to pull on this thing, and it's going to do a linear interpolation between those two to make an in-between. And it's totally linear in this mode, which is probably not what you want. Let me switch it to. Sometimes it is what you want though. I'm going to switch it to the breakdown forward mode, so that now I'm going to do. Actually, I'm going to get rid of that pose because otherwise it's just going to bias with the poses next to it. And I am going to drag this over, and now as you can see, like there's an actual arc there. So
Yeah.
sometimes that matters and sometimes it doesn't, because one of the things that I think is really important about this way of looking at things is that you are going to change stuff all the time, right? So I'm like, oh, you know, it comes over there, like that thing in the middle is an arc, but it's really not the right arc, right? You know, the right arc is, I mean, obviously, like this is
Mm.
kind of messed up and in the middle of her face, but like, you know, I would be, you know, I'm not going to pay too much attention to this because I'm just doing this for demonstration
Yeah.
purposes. You can look at, okay, so her hand. So if I was actually going to do that, maybe I'm going to put this up here, and maybe I'm
Yeah.
going to look at it as an arc that comes through
Yeah.
like that, and I can see the outline of
Mhm.
these other poses, and I can say like, all right, well, you know, like that's the arc that's coming through
Mhm.
there. If I was actually doing that, I might have dropped that down here. I mean,
Uh,
you know, I'm sort of altering the animation a little bit as I go to look at how those poses flow together.
yes.
So there's how it gets
Yeah.
generated, how the in-betweens get generated, which you have some
Mm.
control over, but there's
Yeah.
also like,
Yeah.
here's the arc of the end of the sword, and it's gonna come
Yeah.
around like this, you know?
Yeah, all these things that you're talking about, let me know if I'm wrong, but you have a really nice post also on your blog, and you used,
Hmm.
I think it's Mowgli from the Jungle Book talking about this
Yes.
concept. It's I remember reading your article there, and I was saying, oh, that's a great information there. It's a really, I think it's very very good like advice on how
Sure.
to handle the interpolation, because it's like you think more about the I don't know how to say it like that, but you pointed really well on the article, like the arc as we concept, it's not like that arc, but the visual like feeling that you get on the arc, it's more important. I'm not sure if I'm
Yep. Well, no, I mean,
explaining
definitely.
correctly, but
So first of all, thank you. Like, I'm glad it was like helpful. But yeah, I mean, it's something that I eventually came to realize, which is that one of the problems with CG and the problem with rigs is that it focuses us on specific aspects of the internals of a character, right? You have your hand has a particular pivot point at the wrist or whatever, and this sort of can give you the idea that the movement of that particular pivot point matters, right? Because if you're using a graph editor, that's what it relates to. And even if you're doing motion trails, that's generally what it relates to. But actually, that specific point is totally irrelevant, right, to to what things actually look like. And so the example that you're referring to, and I certainly like people want to go read my blog, absolutely, is one where I took a bunch of stuff. I took a shot from the Jungle Book of Mowgli walking, and I traced where I thought his wrist would be if this were a CG character, right? Like what would be the motion path of his wrist? And it's weird and jerky, right? But it actually doesn't matter. It's smooth anyway. And if you sort of think about it as poses flowing into each other and their silhouettes flowing together, instead of thinking about some specific point that doesn't necessarily matter that much, then it clarifies like basically like what makes animation look good, at least in my opinion, like quite a lot. Um, I feel like, especially for more character animation-y, like cartoony context, but even in more, sort of less cartoony contexts, that part of what makes animation work as an art form is its ability to give these really interesting aesthetic experiences, right? So live action doesn't have that. Live action has doesn't necessarily a representation of reality. Live action can be unrealistic in its own way, but a thing always looks like a thing. Whereas animation has this potential, even if it's subtle, for like a kind of expressionism, right?
yes.
The motion, the motion doesn't look like what that motion actually looks like. It looks like how it feels.
Yeah, I think expression is key here. I think it's because it synthesizes the concept, so it's easier to digest for the viewer.
Yeah.
Or I think it's really powerful tool on storytelling because you can I don't know how to say, but like to make it more like absorbable by the viewer by going not to do the actual thing, but to the intention of the thing, the representation of the or what like impression of what should be the right thing. No, I
Yep.
think it's a good example. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that's a big part of what I think is important about animation, right? Like why do we do this? Like what is it about this art form that's compelling? And I think that while plenty of people have made really compelling stuff in CG, obviously, they haven't necessarily it hasn't always necessarily taken advantage of the medium in the way that it can. I mean, sometimes it really has, right? Spider-Verse is a great example, as is Hotel Transylvania, as is a lot of other films, right? And even though we were kind of talking about the sort of safety in some ways of Pixar films, it's also true that they do a lot of that in their own way. It's just a little bit more subtle than something that's more wholly like expressionistic, like Spider-Verse. Which actually I think brings up kind of an interesting question, which is, one of the things that I think, you were sort of talking about Spider-Verse and the way that Spider-Verse, had a lot of resources, right? This was a major feature film and they had a lot of big budget for it and stuff. And, sort of based on what I have seen and talked to with other people and people who were involved in the production, and keeping in mind that I have no idea what's going on internally at Sony Pictures Imageworks other than what people have told me, right? Is that they are in some ways treating things really differently as they have for a long time, right? You know, because of the need to do these really extreme distortions in Hotel Transylvania and other movies like that. But that in some ways it's not that different, right? You know, you still have a conventional underlying rig underneath. And I think that like my experience basically is that there's a real advantage you can get if you're doing things on twos. Like we talk about expressionism, right? And so there's a reason why people have said in traditional animation, like somehow doing stuff on twos often ends up kind of somehow looking better, even though there's less information there. And of course, part of stylizing something is that you have less information. Um, and uh, but in order to take advantage of that, what I do see people sometimes doing um, is basically taking conventional CG that's been polished in a conventional way, just dropping out every other frame. Right, and that's not what they're doing in Spider-Verse. They're clearly taking very, very care to make this work in the context that they're doing it. But it is something you see people doing who are trying to do it in that context, and I think that that's the wrong approach, right?
Yeah.
Because uh, because the thing that makes that work, right? The thing that like the reason why 2D animation can look good, the reason why 2D animation, even that's fairly like detailed on a surface way, like Claws, right? Like Claws in that the Netflix thing, thing that just
Yeah.
came out where
Yeah.
they're
Yeah. I
taking
saw the
2D
other
animation
movie.
and they're
Yeah.
like tracking, sort of textured elements to it and stuff. But a lot of that stuff's on twos, right? You know, even though it's extremely highly rendered, as it were, from the point of view of traditional animation, because it's animated with real care to the way that shapes flow together, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's something that CG actually really discourages in a way. Like it's not what CG was ever made for. It's not that you can't do it, right? Obviously, people have done it and done it well, but it's really hard. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you see things like, well, you know, if you want to do that look really well, it certainly helps to have a budget of
Yeah.
whatever kind of probably
Yeah.
quite large budget Sony had, right? But
Yeah.
I think there's a potential there for that not being the case. I think there's a like kind of everything that I've aimed at here, and this has been a long-term project that may or may not ever reach fruition, but I really hope that it does. Right? Is that I want to be able to make animated films in a way that isn't crazy expensive, right?
Yeah.
That's like the overall goal, and this is a part of that, trying to be able to do that, and it means understanding things about where your production value can come from
Yes.
that don't necessarily rely on resources, right?
You think with your system, in terms of like, when we say like the making films, like they're more like in budget or cheaper, but in a way that it's not like cheap in the production value, but cheaper in
Right,
that you can do it, maybe not I mean with a smaller team or
yep,
uh, like more under a more controlled situation where you don't need to spread like on over 100 artists to make a film in a
right.
reasonable time frame, no? So how you see your system on terms of like, because like the amount of quality animation that you can do with your system, I think you already using it in some productions, or you
Yep.
want, or soon. So do you think it's a better like balance at the end, or how do you feel on that thing? I mean, because one thing is what do you get like with a good quality, I think, but it's also relative. I mean, quality, it's
Sure.
something very abstract, I think. But how do you feel like the process? Can you like um see that it's gonna be let's say faster process in terms of like, okay, I can do this animation maybe a bit faster than the traditional ways, or yeah, how do you see that?
I mean, basically yes, right? Like, and exactly how much faster is a question that is yet to be completely answered, right? But I mean, I'm gonna say I think that you could do animation of a particular level of expressiveness, right? And it's not necessarily going to look exactly the same, but it's going to be of a similar level of like expressiveness and audience interest, right?
Hmm.
Appeal. Maybe even more so, I think, or reaching for that same level. I think that you could. I'm just gonna guess from my anecdotal experience, right? Which like there aren't hard numbers behind this, and I'd need other people to try it and see how it works for them. But I'm going to say that under some circumstances it can be twice as fast. That's a big claim, right? That may or may not always be true. It's going to depend on the style. It's going to depend on the shot. It's going to depend on a lot of things, but I think that potential is there. And I also think that it is very well suited to being able to do something with like high production value of this kind. In the context of like a real-time production environment, which obviously that's like a big subject these days, without needing to necessarily build out a world in the way that we usually do with CG stuff, right? And this, you're coming from an anime background. I mean, maybe this is, I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that you've encountered too. Like you could have these, like relatively speaking, in traditional animation, making backdrops is a relatively small part of the. I mean, obviously it's still a lot of work, but like compared to the characters, doing backgrounds is relatively, inexpensive.
Well, I to be honest, I'm on, I'm working on here in Japan, but my task is a rigging, so I don't have a really good grasp of how much takes to make the backgrounds. I can talk about for our studio that we do, I mean, some like made paints and things, but the vast majority of backgrounds that we use, it's a full 3D background.
Yep.
So it's quite costly, honestly. It's quite expensive the way that we work, and the reason is because, well, obviously because we work full CG, 3D mean, so we want to have the freedom to move cameras and everything and the action, so follows along. So we don't need to log all the layout until last minute and things like that. Even the style that we use to do in some of the productions, it's very it works for the camera. I think that's it.
Yeah.
So if you really change layout, you need to redo the animation basically because it's very stylistic. But honestly, I cannot say anything about the backgrounds in terms of how much cost against the characters. I think maybe less, but I'm by the trying to. My memory, maybe the team is smaller, but not sure, honestly.
Yeah. What I'm sort of thinking about is not in a 3D context, right? I'm talking about like 2D backdrops. Because basically what I want to be able to do is have CG characters that feel like they fit in a 2D background, both stylistically and in, and the reason for that is that, well, I mean, just like the sheer amount of asset production, right, that has to go into a film that's going to feel like it has some scope is quite significant. Versus an illustrator, a painter, concept artist can go and paint whatever they want, right? Like they don't need permission from the pipeline just to have the stuff necessary to do what they do. And that's also a something that I kind of want for CG, because I feel like there's multiple sort of there's multiple practices that support each other in terms of bringing down the logistical complexity of animation production, right? And then that's not just bringing it down from where CG is at, but hopefully bringing it down from where traditional would be at, trying to do the same thing, right? Traditional animation is also quite expensive, right?
I know.
And so in the context here is like, well, you can get a lot of these advantages that traditional animation had stylistically, but with this approach to animation, but it has it doesn't require you to actually draw and clean up every frame, right? And conversely, you can get a lot of these advantages of CG in terms of like, well, you can have camera placement and you can have a character where you don't need to do ink and paint on it, but you can just paint backdrops, right? Which means you can have huge scope potentially in some respects. Not in every respect, as obviously what moves in those backgrounds is a whole different question, but without having to pay the normal cost for it in a CG context. And like, the experiences I've had with trying to do this has been pretty positive. I don't know if you've seen the new Pioneers short that we did with Chris Perry.
No, I did. It's on your website.
It is.
Sorry. Oh, I have to check. Yeah, I will check today.
Yeah,
sure.
or the monkey test. that me and Chris
Y-
did working with Vintata is also a
Yeah.
good, like, actually a better example because this is further along and we were getting better at figuring out how to make this stuff look and stuff. But yeah, I mean, the production for New Pioneers, which is like a 3-minute short, it's got a lot of action. It's a
Mhm.
and there are aspects of it certainly I look back on now and I'm like, okay, well, there's stuff I didn't understand at the time about the best way to pull this off, and it doesn't all
Mm.
work as well as I'd like it to now. But I mean, I animated like that had like a we weren't getting good data
Mhm.
on exactly what it took at the time,
Mhm.
because we were too busy running around trying to make it happen, right?
Mhm.
But basically, we had a 3 to 4 month production there, right? So it's very, very truncated production.
Mhm.
Um, and I animated. I did most of the rigging myself,
Mhm.
and also animated about approximately, and this is a guess, but approximately 65% of it
Mm.
personally,
I see.
right?
I see.
And like actually in that context, right? In
Mhm.
that in the context of such a truncated production, like that's not normal, right?
Mm.
Exactly how was I doing in terms of seconds per week? I'm not entirely sure. Like I can maybe extrapolate it, but it's all guesswork at this point because we didn't keep good records of any of that stuff.
Mhm.
But certainly I'm gonna say, and this was using an early form of an ephemeral system that we had done called Phantom Tools that doesn't really do
Mhm.
what the ephemeral system does now and has some disadvantages that the ephemeral system really doesn't have.
Mhm.
But still is sort of like taking a lot of the same concepts and ideas and trying to implement them.
Mhm.
Um, is yeah, I mean the idea that I really want and is
Mhm.
you could sit down with a really small team of people
Yeah.
and here's how I sometimes talk about it to like animators. It's like, okay, or to producers, it's right.
Mhm.
Your conventional team for an animated show, or maybe show is the wrong word, like but it could be a TV show, right? But
Mhm.
let's say we're talking about a film or something of film length, right?
Yes.
Is and you want this to have pretty high production value. You want it to have like a lot of visual interest and action and scope and things that adds production value to your film. And like yeah, I mean, how many animators do you need? I mean, maybe you need 50 animators, right? That could be easily be true. And maybe you've got like 5 or 10 or who knows what, right? Depending on the production, right? Like lead animators that are sort of riding herd
Mhm.
on this large animators, and a lot of their time is being
Yes.
spent managing,
Yeah.
keeping everyone on model, right? As it were.
Yes.
Even if it's not really on model because it's CG
Yeah.
conventional rigs, you
Yeah.
can't go off model. But it's like well, it's keeping everyone stylistically coherent and keeping everyone, expressing the right things for the characters, and like there's a lot
Mhm.
of work in that, right? So
Yes.
the way I sort of try to pitch this is, all right, what if you could do the same exact production, and all you need are your lead animators. That's it. Right? You've
Yeah.
got like between 5 and 10 people who
Yeah.
are like know everything in and out, and they do the whole thing themselves. And
Yeah.
logistically speaking, in every respect, that reduces things tremendously, right? Like even from the point of view of HR, right? You're like, well, you have to find your 50 animators
Yeah.
somewhere, right? You have to hire
Yes.
them, right? That's a whole burden on your
Yeah.
production.
But
Just in terms of finding the right people.
yeah.
Um,
But just in
uh,
terms of managing and communication, the
yep,
amount of time that you spend on meetings, rounds,
yep,
dailies,
yep.
that's a tremendous overhead there on time.
Yeah. And so what I think, right, is that a lot of people get into this situation where it's like, okay, well, if you make a short film, right, with a small team, you sort of do everything very directly.
Yeah.
And then you try to move that kind of production style into a large project and it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
You have to sort of reverse economy of scale where the
Yeah.
logistics of doing the project
Yeah.
overwhelm
Yeah.
the you know what I mean?
Yeah. Twice of people doesn't make it twice as faster. That's it.
Exactly. And if it were possible to do longer form productions with a small team, you'd
Yeah.
reap these huge advantages in terms
Yeah.
of cost savings.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I can confess. I wish there is a point where we reach like with tools like yours or your approach or other new tools that maybe we can imagine now, but they probably they're gonna come in the future. I I envision like that you can be like a author in animation, like in the
Yeah.
comic book industry with a novel graphic. There's an author on the graphic novel. I in just one, maybe two persons doing like a full feature film, like really. That, I mean, I I I hope we reach, and probably it's not gonna compete with like Pixar's or Disney's or the big studios of today. Like it's gonna be different niche because graphic novels also have really a trade-off. Normally black and
Sure.
whites, and the style it's um, that works for the graphic novel. But I wish we reach that point. It will be like a dream come true. Like honestly, if everybody can be an author. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, that is kind of what I'd really like to see. Although I do think that maybe two people is
uh,
that's I don't think it's ever going to be quite that easy,
yeah,
right?
dreaming is
Um,
free also.
but
But yeah,
but I am talking about like maybe 20 people, right? Which is
yeah,
drastically less than you
yeah,
do for a
exactly.
normal animated film, right? The 20 people would still be something, hopefully, right, where you can have someone with a really strong creative vision who doesn't have to manage lots of people and have a tremendously complex structure to manage them and disseminate what you're trying to accomplish, and works really directly with artists, and still has that ability to be an author more easily than you can have in the feature or TV production world now. Like absolutely, that's what I would really like to see. And people could tell different kinds of stories. Like, I mean, a
Yeah.
big, this was something that I really, I haven't. My most notable experience in the feature animation world was actually a long time ago. I was working at Blue Sky for a while, working on robots for a relatively brief period of time, like in the early 2000s. And like they were kind of being buffeted this way and that, trying to make something because it had to be a huge hit, right? Because if you're going to pour, I mean, I don't know what their budget was, but I'm sure it was a lot of millions of dollars, right?
Hmm.
If you were going to pour, if Fox is going to pour that much money into this film, it has to
Hmm.
be a four quadrant hit, right? So
Yeah.
obviously they were constrained in what they could possibly make, and I think that issue really stuck with me, right?
Hmm.
Even though I haven't worked in the feature world for a very long time, I've only been doing commercials and web advertising and like VR type stuff. So I mean, I've kind of done like I've kind of been all over the place in terms of the kind of projects that I've been doing,
Hmm.
but uh, partly because I didn't really quite like that experience, and that's maybe not fair because that's one particular experience, but like, um,
Yeah.
I could see how people with really strong creative ideas had a hard time working within the context of the necessities associated with
Hmm.
making CG
Yeah.
animated films. Um, and I mean, my own experience has been kind of a, I talked a little bit about coming from the opposite point of view on how to make CG animation, and that was really extremely true. Like when here I'm maybe tangenting again a little bit, but maybe it's kind of a worthwhile. I let me
Yeah, I
know
think.
when
Yeah.
we're getting too late though, because I
No,
really
no, don't worry. I mean,
yeah.
I love to talk about these topics. It's not about everything about rigging and tools, but more
Yep.
like the work
Yeah.
and user experience. Yeah.
Right. So I like a lot of people, right? Like I got into doing CG because I wanted to make movies, right? Like that's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's like, oh my gosh, like when you're a kid, right? You're
Yeah.
like we could maybe like make stuff, and I was looking at like I'm old enough, right? Where when my formative experience with CG actually predate a lot of people's, like they predate CG in the feature films completely, right? Toy Story came out when I was a teenager.
Yes.
Um
Yes.
and like my formative experiences were actually seeing things like like really early 80s, certainly Pixar's shorts, but also a lot of the other sort of rough CG of the time, like
Hmm.
um and things like Chromosaurus, right? Which I actually had to, for a recent post, I had to hunt down Chromosaurus. I actually found someone who put it online, and it's like kind of crazy that this would look cool from today's point of view. My God, right? Like
Yeah.
this is, and I'm sure they spent hours rendering something that would be beyond easy. Like you could render on a phone in real time now, right? Like you
Yeah.
could render on an old phone in real time.
Yeah.
Um, so it's kind of
Yeah.
it's kind of funny to see
Yeah.
how things have changed, but
but it's
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's getting there in some like I was just recalling now this feature film done by one guy, very
Mhm.
young guy, the Away. Do you know this feature film?
Could
Away,
you say it again? Away.
Away.
I think maybe I don't.
It did. I mean, it took what he could of the like say, okay, I'm one guy doing this,
Hmm.
so it did some short films previous to this one, and it did everything render on the Maya like viewport 2.0 and everything, and it looks amazing. I mean, I
Yeah.
just saw the trailers, and it's available on Amazon and I think Vimeo in the States, not yet here, but I hope I can watch this feature film soon. Maybe it's gonna be released here also.
Yeah. I
But
will
you should
definitely have to
check it
check
out
it out.
because it's I think it's a beautiful example of how much a person can do. Obviously, I think it took 4 years for him, and it's
Yeah.
like a very relatively young, like I think 20 something, and only doing that. So it's very like extreme case,
Sure.
but it's getting there. I think it's getting there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like people have done that. I mean, uh, remember Killer Bean Forever? I don't know
Oh
if you've
yeah,
ever noticed any of
Jeff.
this, but
Jeff,
right, like,
I
yeah,
think
like
yeah,
Jeff
was the
Lewis, Jeff Lewis, like he made it work. Like he succeeded in making a feature film. I'm not sure that the process he used to make it would be viable in a lot of other contexts, right? He
mm,
had to do things in a really, really specific way. But yeah, I mean, I guess my dreams aren't quite being able to do things all by myself because I feel like the creative task of making a feature in
mhm,
and of itself is hard to reduce that far, right?
mm,
But still reduced like way beyond what we have now. I
yeah,
absolutely want to see that happen.
yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I was about, but yeah, I think yeah, it will be nice to have more Bill Clintons in the future.
Yes, yes, right. There's another good example, right? Like he's
Yeah,
he's definitely an author. Although I like his shorts a lot more than I like his features actually. Some of
yeah,
his shorts are really brilliant.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, another aspect to it too has to do with sort of the appeal of things, and one of the things that Spider-Verse is really changing, right? There was a time when I think people really had the idea that like, oh, really stylized and like high, like very graphical stuff wouldn't sell, and obviously that's not true.
No, no,
So
it proved
like,
wrong now
nope, it made lots and lots and
with
lots and lots of
by the
money and was
numbers.
a huge cultural thing. Like, nope, nope, nope. That is not true at all.
Yeah,
I was very happy to see that,
yeah,
and uh, but in a lot of cases, people have sort of sectioned off animation. I mean, I guess it happened in film in general to a certain
yeah,
degree, right? It's like, well, you have your Pixar and Disney, big blockbuster type things, and you have people like Bill Plimpton or
yeah.
I'm blanking on his name, but the guy who does those sort of like stick figure. Oh man,
Oh yeah, the World of Tomorrow
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
I am also blank. I watch all the Such a Beautiful Day, and I think he did World of Tomorrow too. And it's the World of Tomorrow. It's brilliant. And how was the other one? Rejected. This famous short film.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, exactly.
brilliant. Yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
anyway, my point being like, that stuff is actually really awesome. But it's not like you're never really going to take Bill Plimpton
yeah.
and be able to sell him at the
No,
multiplex,
but
right?
it's the same. It has audience. Everyone has his
Oh,
audience,
absolutely.
and
But
if you find a niche for your audience,
yep.
yeah, it can be viable, of course. But
Um,
I'm sorry, maybe we we are going a lot of tangent now.
we
And
are really tangenting,
yeah,
right?
and I think we are running on like maybe 1 hour and a half, and I would like to retake this conversation maybe in another episode, like more focusing on these tangents straight. So
Sure. Well, we probably should wrap up. I mean, I would love to come back on the podcast and do
yeah,
another
yeah,
episode. Like, there's so much more. Like, we didn't even really
yeah,
talk about rig tools and spline based
yeah.
deformation, like which is actually something. So I will say this: we do not have any kind of notional pipe, which is the company that I formed with Brian Kendall and Tagore Smith after Anzovin Studio sort of stopped being a thing, to release our products. Um, we are we are not yet at the point where we have like a website up where you can
Hmm.
buy rig tools, but we actually are, and we've just actually started doing this. Like it's production tested and it's stable enough that we are actually starting to sell it to people. We're doing it on
Uh,
an individual basis right now
oh, cool.
because we don't have the infrastructure
Uh,
yet to offer it. Just like go to a website and buy it, but
yeah.
like if people want to get in, and like we'll have an official announcement about this at some
Okay.
point, but
That's great.
if
Where
people
do
want to
people?
actually
Yeah.
buy it and use it in production, like we're ready to actually support that.
Yeah.
Not the ephemeral. To be clear, not the ephemeral system. That's a prototype right now. But the rig tools, spline based rigging stuff.
W-
Like we're pretty like we're pretty ready for that.
Where the people can find you? Can you give us some of like website and other social media that
Yeah,
can
yeah.
can people
So
reach
if
you?
uh, you can go to my site, which is sort of my production site of like, you should hire me to do animation productions at RAF Anzovin, www.rafanzovin.com. So that's my name is spelled RAF, which is actually short for Raphael, but I pretty much use the RAF form of it in every context, including on legal documents. Sometimes I probably shouldn't do that. And Anzovin is ANZ as in zebra, OV as in Victor, IN as in Norman. And so rafanzovin, one word.com, that's sort of my production site, like, sort of portfolio site. And then if you go to just to do something bad.com, this actually comes from a Glenn Keane quote, right? That he said, a couple of interviews he mentioned this in relation to Tangled, where he tries to do CG animation and he's like, um, you know, like this is terrible. Like you have to work so hard just to do something bad. So just to do something bad.com, that's my blog where I've been blogging about, ephemeral rigging and like sort of documenting the process of developing the system as I've been developing it and talking about my ideas about animation production and like how we can make animation be less hard to do, but still good. And that's sort of the other place. Um, that's where, for instance, I have my SIGGRAPH presentation. I think was one of the most recent posts, and there's a whole archive of stuff. And anyone who's interested in the stuff I've been talking about, it is a little bit of a read because it's kind of hard for me to condense this stuff. I mean, the SIGGRAPH presentation I think does a reasonable job of it, but there's a lot of material, and I certainly write. Like if
Yeah, I read it.
if
So many of them. I
things
think
here
all.
didn't make any sense, maybe that will help it
Oh,
make more sense if you want to put the time into reading some of that. Um,
well, yeah. Thank you so much, Rafael or Raf. Sorry,
no
I
problem.
should.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, it's not that no one ever calls me Raphael. It's just not like ever since I was a kid. It's people call me
Raf.
Raph. So I'll,
Yeah.
I'll answer to either one. I don't care. But
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to have you here, and I hope we can do an probably not too far away maybe a second episode where we
absolutely.
go straight in the tangent.
Yeah, that's right.
That
We
I
can go
love
straight
that
into
part.
like
Maybe
all of this stuff that maybe was a little off topic.
yeah,
And even a lot of the stuff that was on topic, but that we just kind of didn't get around to, because
yeah,
I feel like, for instance, I didn't really like you were asking me like, all right, so how do you actually use the system? Like, how do you like? And I showed making it in between, but that doesn't really answer that question, really, right?
no,
So I would love to
yeah,
come back and
uh,
do this more.
yeah, for sure. No, thank you so much.